started on our third and final panel, which is on materials, considerations, and systems upgrades, and all of the hands-on sort of detail work for this room. And our moderator for this panel is one of our most recent graduates, Sherry Cable. Sherry was also the recipient of the Niagara Foundation Award this year, and she's going to be doing documentation on Mennonite vernacular Georgian architecture in Jordan for all of the academics in the room. But she's our Jill of all trades. I like to say she's worked on masonry restoration projects, and she was it you who said it was great to be like part of an all-girl masonry team going onto this church site because it made everybody look twice. And she also is really interested in doing anything with fixing wood as well, materials conservation. So, ladies and gentlemen, Sherry Cable.
Yeah, so let's get down to some of the nitty-gritties about fixing up this room. I'd like to introduce Robert MacKenzie. Robert is a principal owner of Cortec Group Incorporated, architects, engineers, planners, and project managers, which is a multidisciplinary consulting firm located here in the Niagara region. His company provides a wide range of design services to clients in the private and public sector. His experience includes feasibility studies, space analysis, schematic planning, graphics, interior, and landscape design over a wide spectrum of building projects. Robert has experience with the,
That too.
Sorry, I'm giving it all away. Oh my gosh, okay. Experience with the energy design and building systems appropriate to historic restoration projects. That was just a preview.
As alluded, I am an architect, not an engineer, even though we're going to be going into the dark. Are there any engineers in the audience? Good, that's fine. And you can come closer to the front if you'd like now, knowing that. But we'll start in on this, and I'm sorry this is not going to be nearly as exciting as perhaps the previous more theoretical aspects of this project, this room. But I'll try to make it interesting, and I do want to get a little bit of a pitch in about architecture, because that's what I really like to do. And Crystal was kind enough to bring me in as a pinch hitter. So I will fill in where I can, and that being the aspects of systems. So without further ado, I regard this as architecture, and anyone else in this room probably may or may not share that. But it speaks to systems, and it speaks to buildings, and it speaks to habitation, it speaks to art, and I think it's probably a good prelude to that. My background goes from quite rational and quite romantic aspects of architecture. Did some studying in Rome, Aldo Rossi, and then this, I don't know where it is. Anyone know where that is?
Mississauga.
Yeah. But no, certainly my background was theory and in restoration and historical architecture appreciation. So when I got to Niagara, starting off, some of our later has got involved with a couple of firms, predecessors to Cortec, got involved with a lot of smaller renovation and restoration projects. But we also, with the engineering component there, I've said it, we did get evolved a lot into building science related projects that I will admit a lot of them were largely dealing with structural restoration, repair work on buildings. We did studies down to the southern end, Point Avenue Lighthouse is one example where we provided concept designs for that. To the extent that they decided they couldn't afford to do very much of it, and so the building is still somewhat on the downward side of things. Anyone know where this is? This is at the Niagara test. Close. No, but it's very close. The mist, does that help? Okay. This is the roof of Ontario Power Generating Station. We just recently are working on a roof study as part of a larger role for Niagara Parks Commission in hopes that someday, maybe even this year, there will be an RFP or an unfolding for an adaptive reuse that will again find some suitable uses for this and the other wonderful power generating stations that exist around the falls. So that's that building in its heyday, and that is the maiden mist, not the Hornblower. This is another roof shaft, and then this is another power station above the falls. And again, we just are doing an update at the moment on the roof condition from a previous study and involvement with Mr. Clinton Brown in the back, who's a co-author of that conservation study earlier on.
I did what you told me, Rob, and it worked out.
Quiet back there.
Did they show you my study I did 20 years ago?
I think there is one in there. There is, yes. So I think the big issue here is saving buildings. Another one that is involved with our past director or our current director is with Julian was involved with the St. Thomas Psychiatric Hospital and doing an assessment, and out of that an adaptive reuse. So it's a difficult building to put one's head around. It's vast, it expands, it has a lot of repetitive elements. It is a wonderful example of architecture, but it is very difficult to find a home for it, given its location and the general adaptive reuse studies are going to be a real challenge in whether or not we can find something that will just be able to save it. So a lot of thought has been put in. We did do something that was, again, a collaborative effort to come up with some ideas for that. Schools, you know, your traditional schools, different developments where we've tried to find options for that. Then there's the other option I wanted to bring up, because this is going to, is it Greenfield Village, if I'm not mistaken, where Mr. Ford was able to go to England and pick up a whole cottage and move it anywhere he wanted it to, which is great, you know. And I'd love to see more of that when it is suitable and there's no other option available to you that you do that. But we have more local situations that I wanted to bring to the attention of this group, where I happened to be on a Municipal Heritage Committee meeting, and we had to make a very difficult call about a building that, again, is a early 19th century example of a beautiful farmhouse, story and a half, that the owner now is faced with the decision that he's got to tear down, or someone, maybe from this audience, can move it and find a new home for it. This is in the office. Please ask me about it. I can give you more information if you are interested, or you know somebody who's looking for a farmhouse and has a place for it, that's prepared to move a brick farmhouse in its entirety, and it's big, to another area. Please let me know. Anyway, one of my other roles has been working with Willowbank on the rationalization of getting a building code that will allow much more things to happen here on the up and up, with all the life safety requirements of that. So I will go into that in a little bit greater detail by escaping out of this and not losing anyone. I'll probably just quickly go on to this one here, which has lots of little pictures here. That's all that history stuff. Everyone's been there for that. How do I make this work? One more, please. Okay, so you don't know inside of that. Okay, there's some back stuff here. Water supply. What we're doing is getting sufficient water supply into the building to allow for the facilities for sprinklers. So archaeologists, we have looked at that, and we believe we found a way that is will have least impact. Horizontal boring, using ravine slopes to mitigate disturbing any archaeological finds or minimizing the types of risks that may revolve around that. Oops, where's it going? Oh, it's my thumb doing that. My apologies. So can I go briefly through the sort of a general overview of the plan here? Where did I? No, that's a really big blow up here. Okay, my thumb is doing more than it should here right now. Here we go. So a quick touch on it is sort of where we're looking at right now is dealing with barrier-free and dealing with exiting on the ground floor. And so that's a very quick early concept of it. The floor that we are now on and the room which we are standing on, largely intact in terms of its layout, but we are looking at it all possible, providing accessibility by way of an elevator to this level. Jeez, this is really hair trigger. Third floor, again, bringing this up future down the road, being able to offer a secondary exit of some form and a universal washroom at this level. Backing out to, there's all kinds of elevator systems we can talk about, but I'm going to try and confine my discussion to mechanical, electrical, and sort of an adjunct of both of them, life safety. How am I doing for time? 5 more minutes?
About 5 minutes.
Okay. Mechanical. The real, breaking that down into terms of systems, plumbing hasn't changed a whole lot. Water still is going downhill, and size and methods of plumbing are largely the same. There is more plastic plumbing systems, so we're not dealing with copper in fact, we're very, very rarely now dealing with copper in any new installations within the building. There are some pluses to that in that the flexibility of the piping allows us to do less damage to existing building frames, so there's a plus in that. But again, largely plumbing hasn't made significant changes in the draining end of things. On mechanical, heating, venting, and air conditioning, we'll go backing up to the building code. I would have to say that the building code for here in Canada and dealing with buildings such as this, we have, I think, probably more flexibility in the building code than we have in the past. There are still some limitations, though, in 2 other governing rules or guidelines. That is the National NFPA, the National Fire Prevention, and Ashleigh, which is dealing with heating, venting, and air conditioning. They are they lumber along, and they are very effective tools for setting boundaries, but I wouldn't regard them entirely as being able to seek out bold new ways and creative ways of getting to the end game. So I think it still is incumbent upon us, and particularly as architects and the engineers that we hire, to find alternatives where there is some flexibility within our building code and within both of those documents to try and find ways that we can use natural ventilation more, and where we can use some of the inherent attributes of the building itself to work with us. We have this huge heat sink here that is wonderful with all this stone that not only deals with thermal moderation within our building, but it also deals with moisture moderation. We fail often to think about how much of a big giant sponge this building is and how wonderful that is, even though it may feel damp and kind of an English spring feel all the time. At the same time, it is wonderful ways of balancing our relative humidity within the building. So I'll talk about those high-level things that, as someone that does work in this field where we are dealing with sensitive heritage buildings, being conscious of how they are unique in many characteristics. They may leak a little bit more, but on the other hand, they have wonderful other aspects to them. And we can't just go in and start to hermetically seal heritage buildings. So keeping that broader mind in view, I will talk about HVAC in the sense that we're still compelled to provide certain levels of natural or mechanical ventilation into buildings such as this, we're still compelled to provide a certain amount of BTUs and air conditioning loads if we choose to have the levels of comfort that we have been now accustomed to for year-round. I know Crystal was specifically asking if we could keep it cooler in the winter than we have in the past.
Definitely.
No, yeah, okay. And she would miss her fireplace that she holds on to and embraces. But no, the intention forward would be bringing and introducing probably a duct-based air conditioning unit. And then within that context, to give you a wide variety, there's obviously a number of different things that we have brought forward as options to look at, cost being still always a factor, but you can go from, I guess, the spectrum of looking at what conventional furnace, the domestic house type of furnace options that are available to us, to slightly more elevated levels of comfort that may involve some form of zoning, so you can get control of different temperature and air volume within parts of your building. And then as we move a little bit further out, possibly looking at heat reclamation, that being where we exhaust air out of buildings typically from our washrooms and our exhausts out of kitchens and other areas that are probably best exhausted. And taking that fresh air and reintroducing fresh air, but exchanging the heat in the process. So I think pretty well now, I think everyone's pretty familiar with that, and it's becoming now commonplace. So that certainly would be the next level of sophistication for a building. So we're always balancing with what costs are available. But I also want to, in this forum, talk about the other aspect. How many have we done? 2 more minutes?
Yeah, more
Okay.
minutes.
All right. So I haven't gotten to life safety yet, but maybe some questions will come. For HVAC, I think there are some new things out there that you should be aware of. And definitely gas, where we have it, is still very cost effective. But if you're looking at the broader spectrum over time, if we're going to say where things are heading right now, gas is certainly a carbon producer, and it's better than some other things, but if we can move towards another alternative, electricity, which I would never have even imagined saying this, is probably starting to move into the spectrum of consideration for mechanical systems. Where that has been seen as being an advantage for some projects is that we are now seeing air conditioning units that are variable flow refrigeration systems, which are very effective. They are, I think there may be one downstairs, is there not? Where you have like a Mitsubishi is one common name, where it's using the idea of refrigeration to actually create heat, and that you can exchange that heat with areas within the building, and you're trading off energy in essence to provide the comfort levels within the building. And those systems have become quite energy efficient, so that their electrical costs often are definitely lower by comparison to conventional electrically powered air conditioning in the summertime. But even in the wintertime, they can produce heat. And people normally don't think of air conditioning as something you use the heat with. But that is actually something you now have to get into your zone of thought going forward. So those are 2 things I'm going to leave you with. The other big and last thing in life safety would have to be the introduction of plastic into sprinkler system options available to you. And the methods of sprinkler systems, we have gone into great detail about what are the offerings for that will be least intrusive, provide misting, provide a inert gas solution if you're dealing with very, very valuable, priceless things. Finding the balance of what makes sense for your building and for the artifact. If it is an artifact, in fact, that's fun. You can make those choices based on what's available out there. And I can go into more detail if you want to know. We're looking at a sprinkler system that will allow most of the work, for example this room, to be accommodated by lifting floorboards on the second floor and being able to do a minimum level of notching to provide concealed pop-down sprinkler systems to provide that type of extra measure of safety that will bring this building to an assembly occupancy type of use. I'm going to wrap it up there, and I'll certainly take questions thereafter. Thank you.
All right, so our next panelist is Ashleigh Bell. Ashleigh graduated with the Willowbank class of 2013 and currently holds a position with the Tourism and Culture Division of the City of Hamilton, coordinating capital projects on municipally owned cultural facilities, museums, and historic sites. She is involved with a number of community professional organizations, including the Hamilton Community Land Trust and the Hamilton Burlington Society of Architects, for which she has coordinated 2 educational series on conservation discourse. Ashleigh attended OCAD and has a background in interior design. She currently teaches architecture in Canada and architectural styles to our first-year students and historic interiors to our second-year students here at Willowbank. Let's welcome Ashleigh.
Thanks very much, Sherry. And thank you all for having me here. I'm so, every time I come back to this place, I'm always eternally grateful for my experience here and, just to experience it in different contexts. And I found that, especially within this room, whoever comes here, different groups of people, they always contribute to like a certain energy, and it's a really great energy that's here today, and I appreciate all of the different perspectives and comments and questions. Cool. I should have known that it was yeah. So I have to say that I, as the only panelist today that is a graduate of the Willowbank program, I feel a responsibility to sort of, first of all, I want to say that this room has been functioning for a long time. It's integral, I think Sasha said earlier, especially for those of us who attended the program before the lower campus was acquired. This room especially was really central to our experience of this place. Initially, when you're first coming to visit the school on open house days and all these shutters are open and the space is full of light, and then also during events. This is from a really beautiful event that we had where we welcomed Gustavo Arroz from Icamos, and he was extremely charmed by this space, of which we are so proud to share, to hold these sort of beautiful gatherings in the evening. It's always a pleasure to come back here every year at Christmas time when this place is filled with music and familiar faces and candlelight. So there's certainly, I think that if I can emphasize anything at the onset of this presentation is that this room does have a lot of meaning to a lot of us already. Also, I didn't include a title for Julian because I feel like it's always changing and I don't know what the latest is. So I just wanted to take note that, this is also kind of what was said earlier as a working laboratory, a place for tactile study. It's not a precious room. You can see that there's, wear and tear, and we're not scared to touch things. I come from a setting where I am responsible for a lot of projects on museum sites, and yeah, there is that sort of white glove approach. And I think what's so refreshing about this space is that it is this incredibly ornate and beautiful, has all these beautiful features, but we're not scared to touch things. We're not scared to sort of use it as a learning model. But then also there comes this respect for the integration of materials. And I think that when you can sort of get behind walls or see behind walls, and our class, Crystal and I are classmates, and we're not only responsible with some repointing work on the outside of the Southwest Wall project, but also to reinstate that interior wall portion, which is a memory that will remain with me for the rest of my life, of a really beloved carpentry instructor, Paul Jacobson, just very, calmly and confidently instructing us as this giant wall was pushed back into place. And, all of us were very nervous, but just seeing the whole thing come together was just so fascinating. And I think it speaks to a sense of ownership that students have over this space. When we can come back here and look at a portion of this room, much like I'm sure Hallie can when she sees this wall, you can see your own work, and I think that's so important in understanding traditional crafts, So speaking of traditional crafts, someone mentioned Montessori school, maybe it was you, Franklin, earlier. This quote was sent to me by another classmate of Crystal and mine, Christina Martins, who just had a baby in December, and she's been reading a lot about the Montessori method. And she sent me this quote because she knew I would have, she knew it would resonate with me. But I think what's fascinating about the Montessori method is that it was developed in the time in the early 20th century when fascism was brewing in Europe. And Maria Montessori was an educator, and she felt completely helpless in terms of the political system, but what she could do was try to instill a sense of peace and harmony in her pupils. So, understanding the connection between, raw materials, we can see a lot of different materials integrated within this space. But I think this speaks to kind of the Willowbank ethos as well. So I've included this quote, and don't get mad at me because I don't have any proof, but I think I sort of came across this fact, and I think this is kind of interesting. There's sort of a folk tale that Mrs. Bright went over to Buffalo to purchase this wallpaper from we don't really know. I mean, a boutique. M.H. Burge and Sons was actually a wallpaper manufacturer that actually sort of had monopoly over the whole U.S. market, and it was centered in Buffalo, but they were a major supplier at one point to the National Wallpaper Company, and then this artist, Charles Birchfield, who was a really well-known artist in his own right, was actually employed by the firm. So you can see this is a specific Country Life in the Hunt has been like immaculately restored and is in a museum in Buffalo. But I just think it's interesting, we don't have any factual evidence of where exactly this paper came from, but I think it speaks to a kind of understanding, historically, artists and craftspeople had much more employment options within industry. And I think a lot of people compare, when I say I'm a Willowbank graduate, they make a lot of comparisons to, like arts and crafts or specifically William Morris. And I'm sort of a Morris geek. But I think he sort of had the similar idea that he really understood that as sort of creative people, as creative beings, we can really find joy in production, and if you can sort of employ people with that understanding, you're really giving back to humanity in a really great way. So I think maybe there's more than what meets the eye to these materials, and there's sort of a story behind them that can teach us a little bit about ourselves and about humanity and about these sort of overriding impulses that we have that sort of lead to an interconnectedness between us. Also, I just wanted to note that it's just sort of this imagery. Through the Willowbank program, we're making a lot of connections between culture and nature. That poster that we had once for the lecture series, Nature, Culture, Culture, Nature, really stood out to me. And, in this situation, you're kind of cut off from the rest of the world. You see these beautiful green views, or for most, our green part of the year, let's say. And, especially on the inside as well, this sort of imagery of trees and landscape. This is one of Elizabeth Simcoe's drawings. And I think they're interesting in that they have these sort of imperfect quality, But they also are sort of they depict a time when we were sort of, settlement was only just beginning, and the sort of southern Ontario landscape, of which this sort of describes, is still very much like a wild landscape. And I often think of that when I live in Hamilton, where there's a lot of really beautiful hiking trails, and often I think, when you're in the dead of the forest, like what that experience is of just relating to the landscape. And I think that's where there's a lot of opportunity to learn from First Nations people, is just like sort of living with integrity with the landscape. So again, these things that maybe don't meet the eye immediately about this room, they sort of resonate within what is taught here, which is primarily important in however the room is used. Someone said earlier about, I think it was Megan, you said something really lovely about the dynamism that happens in here. And this is a place for like provocative thought, discussion. Maybe it's a time to bring up that, often it's called the Bright Salon, which speaks of, like a center for discussion and intellectual thought. And I think that given how unfinished everything is, it's sort of exciting. It sort of resonates within a certain kind of romantic spirit. And I've seen many different reactions to this room, especially on like open house, doors open. You can see everything from the awe and wonder of the different materials that are exposed to then, usually maybe of an older generation, people are concerned for their safety. Or, I would like to talk about the fact that we live in an era where I think that we're really coming to appreciate imperfection in a different way. One of the sort of questions that was sent out was, do you think that sort of contemporary material should be integrated within this space? And I question what is a contemporary material, because I think what's refreshing about this program is it takes a look at more raw building materials rather than sort of hyper industrialized building materials, of which we sort of associate very closely with contemporary designs: glass, steel, concrete, very high carbon footprint to produce those materials. And also, I think that people just are drawn to these spaces. I live in Hamilton, which has a really beautiful, burgeoning creative community. And a very good friend of mine is an events producer, of which I work with her on some, I'd sort of take a background role. But she does these pop-up events in kind of neglected buildings. And the draw that it creates in people, they just are so excited. And I've had the real pleasure of working the door for the last couple of years at all these events. And I just love seeing the looks on people's faces that they can, some people who have lived in the neighborhood for 50 years and they've always seen it boarded up, they can finally get in there and, they just love this raw quality. In juxtaposition with that, there's also this like sort of beautiful classical quality about this space. One of the things I love most in the world is to experience architecture filled with music. And I think that maybe was either instilled in me by my experience here, or just sort of amplified by my experience here. There's something about, again, to speak to sort of our impulses that connect us as humans, the sort of reverence of beauty is so important as sensory beings, let's say. So we really, whether it's to fill this space with a beautiful classical aria or a piece of music, or even small details. I find one of the most fascinating things about studying classical design is really, understanding the impulses behind the ornament, let's say. So take, for example, this sort of meander that we see throughout, a classical revival building. It's kind of a common, it's even like carpet. It stems from sort of an ancient Greek symbol that came from a river and was meant to symbolize the eternal flow of life, eternity. And I mean, that's something that maybe doesn't speak to us right away when we see it on a throw pillow or an Afghan at HomeSense. But it's just fascinating that these things have sort of stuck throughout history and remain sort of tenets of classical design. So this is a photograph. We hosted the Lieutenant Governor last spring, was it? Yeah, early summer. Yeah. And I really just loved, someone sent me this photo the night before it happened, and he was just sort of like, you know, this is where it's going to happen. And I just love the quality of light that this captures in this space. And it really, I included this quote from the Prince of Wales because I do really want to stress that the Willowbank program is important. I work deeply embedded in a bureaucratic system, and it's so refreshing to come back here and sort of reinvigorate one's inspiration and purpose, because the world is changing. Some are slower to change, but I think especially as sort of younger generations come, gain more voice, it's really exciting because, you know, environmental concerns are of the utmost importance. You know, we're sort of coming after an incredibly consumptive era, and we really need to take a little bit more, or a lot more responsibility. So finally, I just want to end this presentation by saying that whatever happens with this room, you know, it can just serve to be the inspiration. You know, this is such a wonderful place to, I think as a designer, I'm always interested in how to create a setting, how to resonate with people on an emotional level. And I think that this place has those characteristics, and that's so important to retain. And so that just requires a real appreciation for what exists now and a careful consideration of anything that is added. So thank you very much.
And our final panelist today is François Furieri. François has over 45 years of experience as a master plasterer. Raised in Spain and the south of France, he began working in his grandfather's studio at the age of 10. His father, uncle, and grandfather were all accomplished sculptors and master plasterers who taught François the trade through apprenticeship. François has learned the traditional methods and is an accomplished plasterer, conservator, and restorer, but does not shy away from using modern materials when necessary.
Yes, and then you can just go through them. Do you want me to put it to the full screen? Or?
Full screen, yes. Can you change a second? Okay.
That's good.
Hello. I would like to start by saying that this school is very important for the future. It's part of the collective memory that is needed for the new generation to learn trades. This is a project, we're going to start by a project in Manhattan. This is the Apollo Theater on Manhattan, 42nd Street, actually 43rd Street. Like in Toronto, you have the Pantages that was on Victoria Street because of the finger link. Same thing for 43rd Street. It was important to have the 42nd Street address. So for this project, our mandate was to remove the whole theater, the whole dome, and the other fabric. I'll start with this one. You can see that in the center medallion, at one point, an HVAC system was installed. And as one of my predecessors speaking today mentioned, times are changing. When we dismantled, we were the first contractor on site, so we dismantled the whole mechanical system. And in this vent, we actually found hundreds of wallets. What happened is that at one point in theaters, seats were much higher. You had an open back. And what happens is that people would actually crawl under the seat because people would keep their wallet in their back pocket or in their purse. So they would actually take the wallet, go upstairs, take the money, and throw the wallet wherever they could. And they ended up in the ventilation. So we were just across the New York Times, and we chit-chatted with people, and the news leaked that we had hundreds of wallets. So it became a New York Times event, and they published it, and people showed up to look for their wallets. And I have to tell you that at the time, people carried dozens and dozens of photos. Very small photos, but they had dozens with grenaded frames, and some people found their wallets. About a dozen people found their wallets. And it was quite an interesting moment. So we had to remove that dome completely. Same thing with the cell vault. Same thing with the, oops. That's part of the squinch vault. So we had not only to remove it, but we had to make it bigger. This is the medallion in exploded version. The proscenium arch was removed in 78 pieces. And this is part of the dome you can see at the back here, where we had to develop a steel structure. It had to be installed quite quickly. We had an extremely tight schedule. As you can see, that's one of the domes that was removed in 2 pieces. We put it back in 1 piece, and we had it on wheels, actually, and New York State asked us to put a lock on the wheels because they were worried somebody would steal it. Yes, sir. So a slice at a time, you can see that all the dome. One of the problems with that plaster was that it was extremely heavy. Theaters were put together in a very short amount of time. Like a theater like the Pantages in Toronto was put together in less than a year. And plaster were piecework, so you would have, instead of having a 30% lime, you would have 40–50% lime. So that meant that you had a terrible delamination of the paint. The paint would not bind properly, and with the moisture, it would just fall off. So we put all the theater back together, and that's just before the opening. The reason I'm mentioning this is because it was the first time that a theater was done like that on Broadway, where you had to actually remove all the straight plaster. What we had to do was remove all the plaster from 2 theaters, the Lyric and the Apollo. The reason was they needed a clean slate to put a new building. So on the footprints of 2 theaters, they built a new theater, HVAC and all the mechanical system, and we went back and we put back all the original plaster. No mold was made. We used only the original fabric, and we put back the original fabric. Now, a few years later, a few years ago actually, in 2009, I got a call asking me if I could remove the plaster. I told them no. It cannot be done. I told you that when I installed it and I anchored to the steel structure, it's not removable. And they called back and they said, no, we need that removed. I said, it's impossible. And we did it. So the reason I showed you that hook is that the hook previously on this one here is part of the baffle system. It had no stop. So what happened is that banging continually on the ceiling at each rehearsal, what you see is the crack system developed by hitting the cell vault time and time and time again. We had to do a complete epoxy reconstitution because it was completely, the steel structure was delaminating. We had pieces that were on the verge of collapse. So that became, what you see here is part of the new fabric because we had to make it 10 feet wider and 8 feet higher. At the background of it, it's all new fabric, but because it was grandfathered in, it became straight fabric, even though it was only less than 20 years old. So we removed everything again, piece by piece. This time it was a lot easier with the proscenium arch, except for the central feature. And we stored it. It was stored into a bonded warehouse, fully insured for an obscene amount of money. And it was seriously damaged. It was water damaged. The crates were all dropped. It had to get all reconsolidated. And this is when Spider-Man came back. So the largest Broadway set design in history of Broadway. That's why they need so much space. And when they came back, we put it all right back. Once again. And the reason I mention it is because doing this method at the time, we created a precedent. The Imperial Theater, just across the street from it, used to be in the center of 42nd Street. It was moved 170 feet west, and they removed all part of all the bottom ornaments and they put it back. Same thing for the Selwyn Theater, just next door to it. And as in last week, the Times Square Theater is now back on, and it's going to be the first virtual 3D theater, and we're going to have to remove the whole theater again. They're going to do a new structure. They're going to have 2 theaters, and it's going to be the first 3D virtual theater on Broadway. 12-minute shows only, but 2 separate theaters, 2 small, much smaller theaters. This is a project of the Pantages in Toronto, where we were given this photo, and we delivered that. And this is a project in Pinkton, where during demolition, they discovered a part of a wall that was englobed into a separate wall. It's like you open the wall and you see another wall. And that wall was extremely weak. A lot of those bricks were uncooked. It was raw. Yes. And so they wanted to salvage part of the stencil, because all the stencil has disappeared in the church. Everything was completely gone. So we were mandated to remove part of that wall. So we actually did it. We actually created a wall within the wall with a wood structure and embedded with sisal. Very European method, not at all English method, more like a Franco-Italian method. We used sisal cactus fiber. And this is plaster preservation. Not only applies to building, but it applies to artifact. This is a map of Normandy from Soldier's Tower. It has, it's a work in progress right now. It was very, you're going to see the work in progress. First of all, we had to do a complete stabilization because it was badly cracked. So we stabilized it, and we wanted to clean it. I don't know if you see the difference here, but you can see the difference between the cleaning. And this is a time where we don't use Vansol. My background in paint conservation comes from my young days working in France, and it was a lot easier over there to use Vansol because you could go in the open air to clean paintings. But in my shop, and this is a very fragile piece, we couldn't, so we use Q-tips and a solution. Now you can see that the blue lines and the red lines are completely water soluble. Different technique, or lack of technique, lack of foresightness. And I'd like to finish with another piece from Soldier's Tower in Flanders Field. That beautiful plaque was actually made out of plaster and was completely shattered. Somebody dropped it and it was cracked, completely cracked. So we had to do a complete rehabilitation of it, do a complete blanket, which means that we reinforce the back, and you have many cracks you cannot see here, and we finish it like this. And this is the finished product. One of my colleagues this morning said that better is the enemy of good. I completely agree, but I would like to continue by saying that talent without technique is only a bad habit. It is very important to be a technician. As conservators, we're not artists, we are technicians. And do not forget that the technique is the most important part of conservation. Thank you.
All right. So I wanted to just redirect this a little bit more specifically to the future of this room. So just to reiterate, this space is used most commonly as a lecture hall. We hold classes here. We're welcome to eat our lunches up here as far as the school is concerned. We use it as a public space annually at Christmas for graduations, different special events, hosting different international members. So there is a public element here as well. But I guess maybe I'd like to start by asking, what do you think our largest challenge is going to be in this project? Is it going to be finance? Will it be rules like the building code and standards and guidelines? Or our audience interpretation and experience? Will the layered anarchist approach be legible to the general public? How much should we care? And is shabby chic just a Pinterest trend, or is it here to stay? So what will our largest challenges be, in your opinions?
Finances?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I sort of agree with finances, but I do think that, you know, wherever that funding is coming from can be problematic in terms of prerogative, you know. It's important to remember that this space is used by many different, you know, perspectives, and that's where the sort of layers come in. And I guess what I was trying to articulate in my presentation, not just saying that this is a trend, this is, you know, I realize that we do sort of live in an era where there's sort of distressed furniture shops popping up on every street, and, you know, it's very much in style. But I think, you know, this place exists beyond trends, you know. This is speaking to a need within our building culture to take a step back and look at how, you know, like how just our, you know, just applying the same methodology as a systemic sort of approach is really losing a kind of quality of space, you know. I think that's, I come from the world of contemporary design, and I left it because I was bored with it. But I wouldn't call myself like a staunch preservationist, or, you know, I think, you know, I have a real interest in the emotional impact of space and design and experiential quality. And I think that is really important to this space, given that it's sort of the heart of this community.
I would say finance still would be at the top notch. Systemically, I think we're quite fortunate because of the inherent floor plate that this room is on, that it has a lot of the basic ways of getting out of the building. And we have early warning measures already in place. There's a lot of the things that, you know, would be the first things that make your hair in the back of your head stand on end in terms of life safety, I think are fundamentally here in place. So we're just layering on things that would be, as a whole building, going to create a higher life safety and allow for more flexibility in how it's envisioned being used. This gives us flexibility. So that's not a challenge. I think that opens up more opportunity. So I don't see it as a negative. Financing is always a challenge, and we need to look at that because that will drive everything else. But we've made choices, I think, already that are driven by finances. They are not necessarily the best choices long range, but they have to be made because of reality of moving forward. You have to accept that you can't wait forever until you get the ideal. So you take a point in time in that continuum and you do the best with it as you can. And that's why systems sometimes get locked in. Sure, there's something great coming down the road 3 years from now, but we're not here there. We're here now. We have to work with the confines of that. But making sure we've got the best thing out there is always very, very important.
Something I thought was interesting that Ashleigh mentioned was talking about how the space isn't precious. We're not afraid to, or at least the way we use it isn't precious. And I grew up in a heritage house that for most of my childhood was in a similar state. And my parents were antique dealers, and they stored the furniture, the very valuable high-end Niagara Peninsula antiques, and we used them day in, day out. And so the home I grew up in was kind of like a showroom or a museum, but and I guess I've taken that to heart in how I look at buildings and how to restore them, is that function comes first, and that we can't be afraid to use them or to alter them to fit a use. So I liked the way that you said that about the space as being non-precious, and that we can't be afraid to use it in the ways that we need to. That being said, I was curious about some technical questions about lighting and heating. So to me, there's sort of three basic options with lighting and heating. First, to run these systems externally as to not disturb the plaster and lath, but then our system are visible. Two, to run them behind the structures, therefore disturbing what's going on structurally, but the visual effect would be preserved. And three, not to install them at all and continue using standing floor lamps, heaters, and fans during the summer. You know, we've got all of these lovely windows. Cooling isn't typically an issue here, except for in the dead of summer where we all retreat to our summer jobs. And how do you feel about those types of approaches? Have I left anything out? Or are there other approaches that you guys can think of? And what do you think about those approaches? What would be appropriate for this space?
An hybrid approach where you could actually chest lines, do the minimum impact on the existing fabric, because the HVAC, and we have to go up to norm anyhow, and the least conspicuous all the mechanical part would be, the better it would be. So minor disturbance to district fabric will be acceptable.
Fully agree.
Yeah, I mean, I agree too. Like, I think what's refreshing about this not being a heavily sort of guarded, protected museum type setting is that there is an opportunity to sort of, I guess, permeate the existing, still respectfully, obviously, and integrate, you know, necessary. I would say though that there is a real, I mean, maybe I'm a romantic, but like I would hate to see, you know, like we have these fireplaces and the candlelight and the sort of, you know, quality of light that comes from lamplight rather than like a harsh overhead light, or, you know, even the fact that, you know, in the evening that is reflected. There's not a lot of lighting on this site, and it's very black outside, so you get this beautiful sort of sparkling quality of candlelight reflecting in the glass. And that all works together to kind of create the magic of this space. So that's just, I wouldn't like, yeah, I think that's something to be considered.
Definitely LED has just absolutely turned lighting upside down, and it will continue to do that, and the costs will presumably continue to go down to where they become quite the norm for anything to be considered. One of the things though I think is great about it is that 24-volt lighting can be a way to minimize the amount of intervention into walls if you weren't already in a situation where you have access. We're very well positioned for this building because there is this ability to access from below and from above without significant intervention. So, but that's something you should be aware of, because the LED lighting, the 24-volt wiring is very easy. There's less rigid electrical code requirements that go with that, so that you can string and feed and do a lot of things in voids without damaging the fabric in the process. So that's something. This particular room, given that it already had registers in the floor, that was one of the determinant points for considering that a forced air system of some sort, whether it's high velocity or conventional, would be probably the most cost-effective solution to provide air handling and air movement, so you get air exchanges in the building when you need them at those peak periods of time when you have a lot of people in the building. But this building has